Hello, my name is Mark Doleman and I'm delighted to host a webinar which is titled Brexit for SMEs. I lead the Propel business, Propel by Deloitte, and we work specifically with high growth, ambitious SMEs. One of the things we hear all the time is, I just don't understand what's going on with Brexit, and I'm not hearing particularly in the mainstream press about what it means for SMEs. So we're very keen to explore what that means with this esteemed panel today. So I'd like, first of all, each of the panel members to introduce themselves. Sally.
Hello, thank you for having us. I'm Sally Jones and I'm Deloitte's Director of International Trade Policy.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Nick Heller, co-founder and CEO of Fractal Labs. We're a fintech platform that helps financial innovators like banks and accountancies better service SMEs.
Thank you.
I'm Zoe Hawes. I'm a director in Deloitte's Brexit Insight team and focusing around supply chain.
Awali Olad. I am in the Brexit Insights team as a consultant focusing on mobility and people issues.
Great, thanks Awali. So I try and follow the news and I try and make sure I'm ahead of the game a little bit, but I have to say I'm losing it a bit now in terms of what's going on, what's happening politically and what that might mean for businesses. Can you, I know this is your day job, can you give us a feel for what's happening and where we're at today, please?
Sure. So let's go back to Brexit basics. We have two separate sets of negotiations, two separate agreements. There's the withdrawal agreement that effectively deals with the divorce between the UK and the EU, and then there's the future relationship negotiations. They are separate and they have different effects. The withdrawal agreement is almost 600 pages of what would become legally binding text if we ever get it ratified. The future relationship is still all to play for. We have 26 pages of best endeavours language around the future relationship. So still something that's very much to be debated and negotiated.
And it's the 600 pages that we're spending all this time debating at the moment, is that
correct?
Right?
So it contains, well, clearly loads of stuff, but four main areas. And those are citizens' rights. Awale can give you much more detail on that, but very broadly on citizens' rights, it says that if somebody has moved from their home state to a host state before Brexit, then they will have moved with a particular set of expectations that they can get a job and marry and raise a family and all of those kind of life-changing things, and it would be really unfair to change the rules on them now. That's in essence what the withdrawal agreement says on citizens' rights. It's got financial settlement, which is effectively the cost for the UK to relieve itself of its ongoing obligations. It's got a huge chunk on the Irish border, which is the really contentious bit, and then it's got all kinds of effectively bits and bobs that cover everything else, like defence and security and all that kind of stuff. On the Irish border, the problem is that both sides, the UK and the EU, genuinely fear that if there is a hard border, by which they mean a border with infrastructure in place, then it will become a target for terrorist activities. Remembering it's only been 20 years since the Good Friday Peace Agreement, and there was a car bomb in Londonderry a couple of months ago, so it's not just a hypothetical fear, there is real evidence that sectarian tensions are rising. The problem being there is no border anywhere in the world that has no physical infrastructure. So the UK's position has always been on the Irish border, well, we will negotiate with the EU such a deep and special and comprehensive relationship that no infrastructure will be needed. And that's an entirely laudable objective, which the EU also supports. But the EU says, well, what happens if we don't manage that? We have to have an insurance policy called the backstop that means that if we don't manage an infrastructure-free border, we have an alternative plan. And that alternative plan basically says that Northern Ireland will, to all intents and purposes, remain in the EU because it will be in the customs union, or the entirety of the UK will be in a customs territory with the EU until something better comes along. And Northern Ireland will remain regulatorily aligned with Southern Ireland to prevent there needing to be that check. Those two things are politically toxic within the Conservative Party and the DUP.
Yeah.
So that's what we're arguing about, and that actually hasn't changed in its essence for many months now. The problem that the Prime Minister has is that she hasn't got a political mandate in Parliament to get it passed through and hence ratified.
Yeah.
There's some warmer language coming out of Whitehall at the moment that suggests that there may be some progress being made. There has not yet been the breakthrough that everybody wants to achieve. And without that breakthrough, the Prime Minister can't get her version of the deal ratified through the UK Parliament. And indeed, nor does the Labour Party get its preferred solution of there being a customs union, a permanent customs union between the UK and the EU. So we're in gridlock.
The debate I'm hearing is that Labour support a slightly, I'm going to describe it as softer, only that's because of the words I hear, but a softer Brexit around a customs union. Does that, if that gets agreed, is that a relatively simple alteration of those 600 pages, or is that in itself quite a complex thing to do?
It's both, is the honest answer. So is it relatively straightforward to put it into the correct language? Yes, because it would go into the future relationship part, which is 26 pages of best endeavours and therefore up for grabs. That's relatively straightforward. It's getting it through politically is the part that's incredibly hard. The other point to just bear in mind is that most people in this country, for very, very good reasons, don't actually ever stop and think about what a customs union is or does. And it goes some way to solving the issue with whether you need border infrastructure between the UK and the EU. It doesn't go the whole way to solving it. We would need to do something else above and beyond that to prevent there being hard border infrastructure. And that above and beyond bit is still very contentious.
One of the things I want to focus on is the impact of this to SMEs.
Yeah.
So, and clearly there are massive impacts to the general public, there are massive impacts in Ireland, as you described. I want to think about what it means particularly from an SME, and I'm thinking about the smaller end of the segment.
Yeah.
And I know we've got Nick here, practical, living, breathing SME. Can you just give us your view of, of what you've had to do to date, just because of your concerns around the uncertainties? Can you just talk us through some of the things you've actually had to take into account?
Yeah, absolutely. So our business is somewhat unique, but maybe not so for the UK, in that we're a regulated financial entity. We have a license, which is an authorized payment institution license under an EU directive, which is called the Payment Services Directive 2. And, by all intensive purposes, the UK and London is arguably the best place in the world to run a fintech business. Some of the most advanced in terms of technology and also in terms of progressive regulation. We've been licensed now for over a year. That license enables us to actually run our business, service our customers, and generate real commercial revenue. On the back of that, we have global ambitions. We have customers and work outside of the UK in other European markets. Finland, Ireland, Netherlands, to name a few. We've had to passport our license, which under the EU agreement allows us to take that regulation and that license that we have and easily transport it to these other European countries. And so, depending on what happens with Brexit, we need to think about how we can commercially operate in those other countries. And just to give you a real example, the Irish authority sent us a letter in the post a month ago saying that our authorizations and license in Ireland will not be valid post-Brexit if we don't do something in advance. So we've had to think about contingency plans around setting up, reapplying for this license in a European market, and then using that as our hub to passport around the rest of Europe. And so we've been investigating a number of different markets like Ireland, like Luxembourg, and a few others to find where it makes the most sense. And clearly there's a cost issue there. There's a real top-line commercial issue for us. So I think that's number one, which is really driving our thinking and keeping us awake. And then the second one, which I'll maybe can get into later, is around people.
Okay, I do want to come on to people, and we'll pick that with the rest of the panel in a second. But on that regulatory point, are you being told that you need to now do something irrespective of the type of Brexit?
No, it is. Well, that's a very good question. And from my perspective in running the organization, it's about uncertainty. So in an uncertain outcome, we have to have a contingency plan for, well, what if we cannot continue to be regulated in the UK and passport that to other markets in Europe? So we have to plan for not being able to do that. And as a result, that means we're looking at these other markets and the costs and the time and the effort associated with being regulated there. It's slightly binary for us, I suppose. It's either we can or we can't. And so we have to plan for we can't.
Yeah, and yours is a very good example of where contingency planning, in my mind, is absolutely vital, because it's pretty much the regulatory side is pretty much the lifeblood. You know, the danger is you just won't be able to operate. So I don't know, Sally, whether you'd add anything to that part of the conversation we've just had around the regulatory side.
Yeah, I think it is worth flagging that it is unusual outside of financial services to find a situation that is as binary as you've just outlined. It is existential for your business. If you don't have the passporting, you cannot trade. For other businesses, it's often not quite as black and white as that. For other businesses, there are additional costs, additional friction, more grit in the system, but it won't stop them trading in and of themselves. So it is important, if you are an SME, to make sure that you are planning in a proportionate way. And although SMEs won't feel this, they have two big advantages over bigger businesses. One is that oftentimes a greater percentage of their business is in the UK.
Correct.
So they have a less exposure to Europe in the first instance, not overlooking that point about wanting to have global ambitions, but it means that they haven't got as much to unwind. And the second is that they are able to be much, much more nimble than a bigger business. So they should definitely play to those advantages whilst not overlooking the risks that they have to face.
I think that's a really good point, actually. What you're saying is this, to some, could be quite an opportunity, actually, to be able to react where the bigger players might not be able to react. But I just want to come on to something which I think, Zoe, you're close to, which is when I speak to a lot of the SMEs that have physical products, they're often, even though they may be small and they may be selling it in the UK marketplace, they're often buying product from overseas, whether that's from the Far East, which clearly doesn't feel like it's impacted by Brexit. My guess is there probably will be some impact, or from European suppliers. And so, when I ask the question, do you think your business will be impacted? Their main concern is really around customs, VAT, duty prices. So, and that's when they go, and I don't know what's going to happen, so I really don't know what to do. And it's sort of, there's an alarm without knowing what to do. What can you just, I set the frame of this as the conversation we're going to have is around a likelihood around either a Theresa May style deal or a slightly softer customs union compromise type deal. I appreciate that any other factor from no deal to no go could come into it, but we want to sort of focus around those two elements. But of course, they're quite big distinctions between the two. Can you give us a little bit more insight into that and what that might mean to an SME?
Of course. So Sally touched on this earlier around, in the Irish border context, a customs union goes some way to solving the sort of frictions you see at the border, but not the whole way. So a customs union says briefly that there's an external tariff that's applied outside, and then within the customs union, goods move without tariffs. So if that's where we end up, then if the UK and the EU are in a customs union, then there shouldn't be duty costs on those goods. But there are still administration and documentary requirements to consider. So if you think about the EU and Turkey, there's still a customs declaration that's needed. There's still a document that's needed to prove the origin. And actually some of those administrative costs can add up quite quickly. So it's sort of thinking about actually what are some of the operational changes I might need to make to manage that. And whether that's sort of looking at systems or having a basic understanding around some of the customs requirements, or speaking to a logistics provider to understand actually what can they do and where can they take the pain away and manage some of that process for you.
You're mentioning a couple of proactive things that people can do around, do you outsource some of this or what? But if we go on a sort of Theresa May style deal, what I understood was that the government had issued some indicative type rates. I haven't gone into that in any great depth. It had a sort of day or two's worth of press and then seemed to disappear again. Is there anything alarming in those rates? Were those rates set at a level which is pretty consistent with where we are today? Or did they send any sort of alarm bells out for an SME?
So that's right. So the government did publish, this is what the tariff schedule would look like in a no deal scenario. And that reduced tariffs 87%.
So can I just be clear, is that in a no deal scenario?
Yes.
So this isn't in a Theresa May deal scenario. So what would happen in a Theresa May scenario?
Well, so there I think it's where it's difficult to say, because that's the exit terms and the future economic relationship, including what sort of duties are there, is still up for play. So
that's still for grabs. Okay.
But that no deal piece in the UK government's announcement is still quite a useful benchmark, because that's where the government said 87% by value of tariffs would be reduced to zero, but tariffs would remain in certain sectors, so particularly say food and agriculture, but also sort of some of the automotive type areas. So that is there, and that's available on the government website. And there's also a series, again, of no deal notices, but a lot of those contain some quite clear and specific guidance over things to think about from a trading perspective if you're moving goods cross-border. Okay.
And so, again, if I understand that then, if I'm an SME, number one, I'm going to look at that no deal tariff rate and just see how it impacts my business. Just good, sensible thing to do. Secondly, what you're saying is the rest of it is up for grabs in terms of it's part of the second phase, Sally, that you were talking about in terms of negotiation. Do we have any steer as to what that might look like?
Not really, other than, as Sally said earlier, it's sort of language of best endeavours.
What's the latest in terms of timing of what could happen and when?
So we've got the cunningly named flextension.
Okay, yeah.
And what that means is that providing the UK participates in the European parliamentary elections, which are scheduled for the 23rd of May, providing we participate in those, we have until the 31st of October to get something agreed, whether it's Theresa May's withdrawal agreement or a customs union plus Theresa May type deal.
Yeah.
If we don't participate in the European parliamentary elections, then we leave on the 31st of May. And people were concerned that the UK might just decide not to participate and leave with no deal on the 31st of May. That's clearly not the intention of the government. We can tell from the fact that we're all getting our voting cards and polling stations set up and all of that kind of stuff. It is possible that if the Prime Minister and Jeremy Corbyn can agree a deal between them, then we might escape having to have those effectively charade elections. But time's getting really quite tight for that. The latest thinking that I'm hearing in the gossip of Whitehall and Westminster, so cutting edge when this webcast is being filmed, but maybe not in a couple of weeks' time, is that we'll almost certainly participate in parliamentary elections, but if they can cut a deal, we may not actually ever get to send those MEPs to Brussels when Parliament returns on the 3rd of July. Yeah,
it's an important thing you say there. We are the 1st of May today, so we can only talk based on where we are today, the 1st of May. Okay, and what I thought I'd heard was that Parliament was trying to make it such that no deal was off the table. Now, I keep thinking I've heard that those votes have taken place, and then I keep hearing that that's still an option. So can you just sort of quickly help me with that?
Sure. So no deal is the default. We leave with no deal unless somebody somewhere decides that we're not going to leave with no deal. Mm-hmm. And it is not within the UK Parliament's gift to decide that. The only way that we can leave with a deal is because we've agreed something with the EU, or we've agreed an extension, which is ultimately the EU's decision to give us or not. So no deal will always be an option until something is signed on the dotted line somewhere.
So that was people playing politics, was it? Tabling those types of amendments, or
largely.
or have I missed it?
No, you're not. It was the Parliament trying to coalesce around an option. So one of the things that the MPs were asked to vote on was, could you stomach leaving with no deal? And they voted no, they couldn't. They didn't want to leave with no deal. But nevertheless,
so it's an indication.
It's interesting. Okay. Yeah, exactly.
And so just picking up on the other side of the Theresa May versus a softer customs union. So, and I think you both implied that even if we get some sort of customs union agreement, that doesn't mean that there isn't work to do as an SME. Can you just, let's say we do soften it to some sort of agreed customs union. What actually does that mean? Because in my own mind, I was thinking that meant it will just carry on. It will just carry on as we are today. Now, I'm sort of getting the sense that's not quite right. Can you just take us through that a bit?
So I think that's sort of right if you think purely from a duty and cost perspective on movements of goods between the UK and the EU. But as I mentioned earlier, there are still implications in terms of the administrative requirements and the documents and the forms that you have to accompany those goods. So that's where there's a change in terms of managing those administration requirements.
And that's very helpful. And I'm just going to try and wrap that one up at the end in terms of the customs side. But I just want to move on to the people side, because I generally see that the conversation goes around regulation, which we've covered, around customs union or non-customs union duty, and then people. And Awali, I know you got yourself very heavily into understanding the impact on people. Can you just take us through what would, we've been focused on the two scenarios of a sort of a closer customs union or a sort of Theresa May style exit. Now, again, layman's terms here, what I'm hearing is that if we were to be bound by the customs union process, then in theory there ought to be freedom of movement, but I don't know whether that's practically right. Vice versa, Theresa May has a restriction on freedom of movement. And clearly from an SME's perspective, big concern, I know Nick, you alluded on it, so I'd like to hear some of your experience in a second as well, but that is the one area that causes a lot of concern about either staff that I've got today or skills that I want in the future.
Absolutely, yeah. So freedom of movement is one of those red lines that the Prime Minister is so strongly committed to. So we'd have to see what kind of agreement comes out of the negotiations between the Labour Party and Number 10. But in the long term, we do have a immigration white paper that gives us a kind of a skeleton to understand what kind of future immigration system we're going to have. And it all leads to European nationals being funneled essentially through what we have at the moment, the points-based system that regulates non-EU migrants. So that's the future end state when it comes to a new immigration system that encapsulates everything.
And so what should we be planning for as SMEs?
So right now, you have to ensure that all your EU workforce are getting ready to apply for or have applied for the new system called the settled status certification process. So if you've been in the UK for 5 years, you're entitled to permanent residence. So that's the settled status process. If you've been here for less than 5 years, you're entitled to pre-settled status, where after 5 years you get the full status. That will be your right up until the day we leave the EU. And it also allows you to bring family members in the future if you have that right, without having to go through a rigorous process.
But we could be leaving the EU as soon as the end of May.
Unlikely, but technically possible.
But we could. Okay.
So up until the day we leave,
Yeah.
you've secured that right if you're in the UK.
So recommendation, look at it as quickly as possible.
Go online, put your details in. It's quite a straightforward process. You put your personal details in, you put your national insurance number in, and it gives you the certification. It's not paper based. It's all electronic. But if you have non-EU family members, it can be a bit more work you have to put into the system, and you get a hard copy.
But there is a system in place to be able to protect your current employees, and how long does that protect them for?
That protects them indefinitely.
Okay.
In the case, so it's equivalent to indefinite leave to remain. So it allows you to be in the UK as long as you want to be in the UK, and it entitles you to apply for citizenship as well if you want it.
So the second bit of that equation, though, is the people I want to hire in the future. We talk about skills gaps, concerns around where we're going. We have been bringing in lots of people from Europe and beyond for many years now to fill some of those skills gaps. Now, you could argue it's a great opportunity for the UK to start to develop and nurture its own talent. Of course, that's one side of the argument. But I'm still likely to want to recruit people from time to time with the skills. Where will we be at in terms of being able to recruit new people from overseas, especially from Europe?
So for now, it's business as usual. So freedom of movement continues up until the day we leave. In the future, it's very likely that you're going to have to meet a skills threshold, pay your future workforce, well, the people you want to recruit, a minimum salary threshold, and it's very likely that you'll face lots of levies and charges around, for example, healthcare, paying a surcharge for the health service, potentially also paying an immigration skills charge. So you'll be able to still recruit EU nationals in the future, but they will come at a premium.
Okay, and we focused on Europe, of course, but will this impact how we do business either from a customs and duty perspective or from a people's perspective outside of Europe? Or is that completely separate, or will any of that be impacted by this?
So from a people side, our current immigration system regulates non-EU nationals only. So that's not going to be impacted in the future. It might be expanded to include European nationals, but at the moment, or in the future, there's not going to be a direct
we don't think at the moment there's an indication of that changing. And from a customs side?
So again, I suppose customs and that customs union point, it's only focused on goods. So anything else around that is not going to be covered by a customs union. So you'd need to look at the individual rules, whether that's around people or regulation or whatever area.
And one of the things that we hear about the opportunities this presents is to be able to strike our own deals, our own trading deals across the rest of the globe. However, what it feels like is striking those deals is quite difficult, and I guess it's going to be difficult while we still don't quite know where we sit with Europe. But is there any indication that we will be able to go and strike these types of deals? Because I guess an opportunity, we are nimble SMEs, is that we can go and start thinking about where we go and trade and maybe piggyback on the back of trading relationships. I think, Nick, you might have been involved in some of these trips overseas. But is there, Sally, to you, but is there something where we've got indication that there are going to be opportunities, or is this proving to be harder than perhaps the government thought?
A bit of both is the honest answer. So free trade agreements are really lengthy, really turgid documents. They typically run to 2,000 or 3,000 pages. They take 5 to 10 years to negotiate if you're lucky. So don't hold your breath waiting for those free trade agreements is part of it. The other thing that you have to bear in mind is that whatever happens with our exit terms, we're going to have to negotiate some form of future relationship with the EU. And that future relationship and its terms will impact on our ability or otherwise to do free trade agreements with other people. So you might remember that last time President Trump came for a state visit to the UK, he said very explicitly that if we tie our hands too closely on European regulatory alignment, it will become very difficult to do a trade deal with the US. Mm-hmm. There's always a balance to be had between what do I want more, ease of business with the EU or free trade agreements with the rest of the world. So there's always that tension to be balanced.
One of the trade agreements I remember hearing was about India. You know, it was one of the places where you sort of think, well, we must have close ties with India. That will be relatively straightforward to do. But it seemed to then get caught up in, again, politics. Is that an example of it's just harder than we think it's going to be?
It is, and one of the issues is that India has said publicly that one of the things it wants to obtain from a free trade agreement with the UK is a greater number of visa access for its people, which goes directly contrary, as Awale says, to the Prime Minister's red line of reducing immigration. So we could have a trade deal with India very quickly if we were willing to open our borders to Indian nationals.
I remember that. So, Nick, just one final point from you. I think we talked about your passporting and the regulatory side. You mentioned people very briefly. I think Awali's giving us something. I noticed you nodding a bit. How has it impacted you and your business? How you dealt with the people side of things?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking, Mark. The reality of our business is we're a deeply technical business, and the UK has some of the best technical schools in the world. I studied at Cambridge, for instance. But there is definitely a skills shortage here in terms of computer science and other types of degrees. And as a result, we have 25 people and 9 different nationalities in our organization today. And although British does make up the majority, we have a bunch of EU nationals, we have Indian nationals and others. And it's critical for our growth and our well-being as an organization to be able to recruit these highly skilled individuals. And it will be very bad, it'll be catastrophic for the technology industry if there is a skills shortage. And technology, I think, undeniably is one of the drivers of economic growth. And we're a fintech, but technology skills cross every industry these days. So good to know some tips for the EU nationals in our organizations, and something that we should execute immediately based on what you've said. We also have applied for a certificate of sponsorship for those that aren't EU nationals, although maybe it might actually work for EU nationals if I'm understanding correctly. But that is a lengthy process that's taken us, we're still not through yet. It's taken us months working with the Home Office. I suspect they're very busy. So it's another additional cost to our organization, and it takes our eye off of our core business as usual trading exercises. And so it is a huge distraction, but obviously something that's very important to us.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. One final thing I just want to ask, and then I'm going to sort of summarise where we've got to. But it's about bringing in goods and selling goods out of the UK when it happens, whatever it is. Obviously, there's all this potential concern around blockades or difficulty in moving goods through borders. And therefore, you're into the question of, do people stockpile? People have been building supply chains. And I don't know, Sally or Zoe, who wants to take this, but I guess I feel like the last thing we want to do is to start people panic doing anything. But do you feel there is concern around how goods will flow when this thing happens?
So I'll start. So I think there was a lot of concern, and you did see a few businesses stockpiling and taking steps around inventory management to prepare for that no-deal scenario, because that's really where the risk was. In a no-deal scenario, much more checks, limited place, not necessarily the experience and the sort of processes in place to manage the delays. So I think where businesses have done that, one of the things they're thinking about now is actually how do we unwind that? How do we free up some of the cash and sort of the strategies in place around that unwinding? I think the sort of longer term question is a bit more around, again, well, the potential no deal date of 31st of October, should there be more stockpiling at that point? But it's also an opportunity to understand some of the processes that can be put in place to help manage those movement of goods, and therefore there's sort of potentially less risk of severe delays because people have had more time to plan for and understand it.
So, open question, is there anything else any of you would like to comment on in respect of Brexit and SMEs before I wrap up?
Yes, so we discussed quite a lot about the EU nationals in the UK, but it's going to be quite critical that businesses understand how UK nationals are going to be received in the EU in the future.
Yeah.
Because we don't have an EU-wide immigration system, each member state regulates its own migration policy. So it's going to be quite critical that businesses understand how they're going to put people in the EU if they need to put people in the EU, and that's understanding each member state's immigration laws.
And it's really important to understand that when we say putting people in the EU, we don't mean sending them to live there. It can be as simple as going for a business meeting in the EU might need a work permit or something similar going forward, and that it's just more grit in the mill. It takes time.
Yeah, because I think most would still have an assumption that I could go and do a few business meetings, go for a couple of days, and you're saying it's not going to be that straightforward.
Might not be.
What I'm hearing is one area where it's a must act fast, and I'll be very surprised if businesses haven't already thought about it, regulation. If there is regulation that's going to super affect your business, you really ought to have spotted it and dealt with it by now. However, please consider, if you're an SME in a regulated environment, you've got to get under the skin of that regulation and make sure you understand it. In the main, we think most businesses, the regulation will be manageable, but there are one or two, like your business, Nick, where it's pretty damn important to the way the business works. So please, please, please look at that. Secondly, we're talking about what I would say are good planning. And you've mentioned it, Zoe, a lot with the customs side. Whether or not we go down a Theresa May style deal or we go down the customs softer route, we're still going to have things to do. We're still going to have a supply chain to manage. We're still going to have paperwork to organise. We're still going to have to, therefore, really plan what that looks like. And I think that's been really helpful because I hadn't really thought that through myself particularly. I think you're saying go and get your ducks in a row in terms of making sure you understand your supply chain, you understand the impact on the paperwork, and it may be an opportunity to outsource if you think you need to outsource it, or at least understand how you're going to manage that. And of course that comes back to being smart about, not panicking, but being smart about what levels of stock you need and where you need that stock. I don't think any of us are sat here on a sort of catastrophic, it's going to be a complete disaster, but we are saying you need to be smart about how you plan that. From an SME's perspective, the way I look at this is, in the main, we shouldn't be scared about the scenarios that come along, whatever they are. We recognise there's a wide range of those scenarios. Sally, there's a whole bunch of other bits of politics that need to be gone through yet, but we shouldn't be scared about it, but we just need to plan accordingly. And I think we've talked about regulation, we've talked about people, we've talked about the sort of supply of goods and the customs side. That would be my take. Would anyone say there's anything else to add on top of that? Or Sally, would you like any sort of parting comment?
No, I think that was an excellent summary. I suppose the one thing to flag is that we do have what we call our no deal checklist. We can put it on the Propel website. It's just a really handy, low-hanging fruit list of ideas that businesses might want to look at and think about whether to put in place.
Okay, fabulous, we'll do that. So that's been a fantastic session. Thank you very much for taking part in this. You've helped me thoroughly in terms of understanding the impact of Brexit for SMEs. So that has been fantastic. So I'd like to, one, thank the panel, and two, thank you all the audience for listening. I'm Mark Doleman on behalf of Propel by Deloitte.